Professor Posen, Professor Brooks, we are very delighted that you could join us today here at the European University Institute in Florence for the Executive Training Seminar on Transatlantic Cooperation. You laid out two very different positions on how the future of US grant strategy could look like. And so we have two very short questions for you and our audience here in Europe.
Yes, thank you again for attending. You've both had very different visions of how much the US should be globally present, with you arguing that the US should withdraw and you arguing that the US should remain deeply engaged globally. But turning that question around, to what extent does the United States need Europe?
Well, I think one thing about the US-European relationship is that it has such great value and is so long-standing that many of the things that it brings are things that we almost take for granted, you know, from the standpoint of huge amounts of trade, huge amounts of flows of people, economic partnerships, educational partnerships. All these things are incredibly valuable. And so from that standpoint, they've almost become so ingrained in reality that these great important things are things that we don't see on a day-to-day basis. We just kind of take them for granted.
A lot depends on your standpoint. From the standpoint of basic U.S. national security, the United States is not very dependent on Europe anymore. Basically a very secure country, and the amount of military power that Europe contributes to our projects is really not very impressive at this point. So the only argument you can make is that somehow the United States has to defend Europe because of its own interests, and that interest would arise if we had some great fear that Europe somehow could be Finlandized by Russia or conquered by Russia. But Europe is a lot richer and a lot more populous than Russia, and it's very hard to believe how this could happen. So at this point, given my way of looking at U.S. national security, which is narrowly focused on national security, basic national security, the United States really doesn't need Europe.
Okay. So one follow-up point would be that within the United States, there's often a discussion in terms of how much is Europe doing to help the United States on the security front. And most people are disappointed. They feel like Europe is not helping enough. But one thing that many people have also said is that when you're looking at something like Afghanistan, there's a reasonable argument that it's much better to have 40,000 troops in Afghanistan than zero. 40,000 is not as much as you would ideally hope for, but 40,000 is certainly much better than zero.
And one final, second question. Does Europe need the US?
Well, I think when we talk of Europe, it's difficult. It's much better to, think of Europe as having three different sets of countries. From a security standpoint, the Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, Eastern Europe, they have a vital need for the United States because of Russia's growing power. At the other end would be a country like Italy, which is very far away from Russia, and for which the threat from Russia is therefore greatly reduced. In between would be a country like Germany, for which it's not nearly as concerned, and therefore it doesn't need the US as much as the Nordic and Baltic countries and Eastern Europe countries, but also has a greater need for it than, say, Italy. So I think you should think of three Europes, not one.
If Europeans wish to continue to underspend on defense, and if they wish to quarrel among themselves about various national prerogatives in the European Union, if they wish to trade freely around the world without having to invest much money in defending those lines of communication, then they need the United States, right? Because it's a great deal. But if you probe more deeply and ask, do the Europeans need the United States because they couldn't survive alone? That's not true. They could do quite well on their own if they were willing to step up to the plate. So it's really a question of what you're willing to pay, not what you can pay, not what you can do, but what Europeans are willing to do. If they're willing to do very little, then they need the Americans quite a lot. And the real question is going to be how much aggravation are they willing to put up with for this relationship? Because from our present precedent, they're going to be asked to do quite a lot in order to earn this level of support from the United States.
Okay. Thank you.